The dawn of 1944 in Texas was a pale, dusty affair. The sun, a mere sliver of molten gold on the horizon, offered little warmth as a convoy of military trucks ground to a halt, their engines coughing their last in the fine red soil outside Amarillo. The sudden silence was profound, broken only by the incessant drone of cicadas and a low, mournful wind that whispered through the mesquite trees. Inside one of these trucks, a group of prisoners sat in stiff, weary silence. They were not soldiers, but women. Their khaki uniforms were rumpled and travel-stained, their eyes hollowed out by weeks of arduous transport across vast oceans and unfamiliar continents. Among them was 24-year-old Liselott Minhart, a former radio operator for the Luftwaffe who had been captured near Cherbourg. Her mind, conditioned by years of relentless propaganda, had painted America as a monstrous landscape of steel cages and roaring furnaces, a nation of brutes where captured Germans were destined for beatings, humiliation, or a slow, agonizing death, digging their own graves under a pitiless desert sun. The heavy truck doors creaked open, and Liselott instinctively braced herself for the inevitable barrage of guttural shouts, the cold, hard crack of a rifle butt against a shoulder. But instead, a calm, drawling voice cut through the tension, its slow, unfamiliar rhythm a dissonant melody in the morning air. "Ma'am, watch your step there." A man stood waiting, his silhouette framed by the immense sky. He wasn't clad in the stark uniform of a guard, but in worn denim and boots caked in dust, a wide-brimmed tan hat shading his face. He looked like a figure stepped right out of the Western films she had seen in a lifetime ago, a real-life cowboy. Behind him, the world opened up into a breathtaking expanse of blue that stretched to the very edge of the earth, a sky so immense it felt unreal. Liselott blinked, her senses overwhelmed. The air carried the rich, organic scents of horsehide, dry hay, and leather, not the acrid stink of gunpowder and fear. All around her, the other women descended hesitantly from the truck, clutching their meager belongings. There were no chains, no snarling dogs, just a handful of American soldiers observing them with a detached, almost bored calm, their rifles leaning idly against their shoulders. The cowboy offered her a tin cup filled with water. It was shockingly cold, cleaner and more refreshing than anything she had tasted since her days in France. She drained it in one go, the liquid a benediction on her parched throat. He gave a slow, understanding nod. Plenty more where that came from. The words simple and kind left her speechless. How could this be? The Reich's narrative had been unequivocal. Americans were savages, a nation of avaricious criminals and soulless factory drones, a culture devoid of honor, living only for the clatter of machines and the accumulation of wealth. Yet here, standing in the gentle, growing warmth of a Texas morning, every one of her preconceptions was being systematically dismantled. In the distance, herds of cattle moved with a lazy grace across the plains. Windmills turned their slow, steady circles against the azure canvas. A dog barked, chasing its own shadow in the dust. The cowboy gestured toward a cluster of stables. "You folks will be helping out around here. Feedin', cleanin', maybe even some riding if you're up for it." Riding. The word was so absurd, so utterly disconnected from her expectations of shackles and hard labor, that a disbelieving laugh almost escaped her lips. When the camp gate swung shut behind them, Liselott turned for one last look at the boundless freedom of the open plains. For the first time since her capture, a feeling long forgotten stirred within her. Not relief, not fear, but a profound and unsettling curiosity. She whispered to herself, half in disbelief, half in awe, This is America?" The scene fades as a narrator provides context. She had been meticulously taught to fear a monster, a caricature of cruelty and decadence. Instead, she found a nation so supremely confident in its own identity and moral standing that it felt no need to hate its enemies, a land where prisoners were offered the reins of a horse instead of the cold weight of chains. Before her eyes ever beheld the vastness of Texas, Liselott Minhart had been certain she would die on American soil. Every German citizen, soldier, and civilian alike believed this grim fate to be inevitable. The Reich's formidable propaganda machine had ensured it. Posters plastered on every available wall in factories and town squares depicted captured German soldiers being tortured, starved in barren pits, or used as human guinea pigs in grotesque experiments. Radio broadcasts, filled with venomous rhetoric, described America as a cesspool of moral corruption, a place where the weak concept of democracy had eroded all sense of honor and replaced it with naked, unadulterated greed. For women like Liselott, the fear was even more acute and personal. Sinister rumors had spread like wildfire through the Luftwaffe's auxiliary corps, whispering that female prisoners were destined for brutal labor camps or worse, to be exploited by the enemy's soldiers. These stories, whispered by stern-faced officers and printed in official-looking pamphlets, wove a tapestry of the United States as a cruel and vengeful empire, its technological prowess merely a disguise for its inherent barbarism. This profound terror was her constant companion throughout the long, disorienting journey west, in the dark, rocking holds of Liberty ships, and on the endless railway tracks that cut a monotonous path through the American heartland. And yet, when the truck doors finally swung open in Texas, the promised nightmare failed to materialize. Instead of brutality, the guards offered food. They used words like please and thank you. It felt unnatural, a carefully staged performance. She wondered, with a survivor's suspicion, if it was all an elaborate trick, a cruel prelude to the inevitable horror. But it was not a trick. It was the manifestation of something the Third Reich, in its ideology of absolute power and racial supremacy, could never truly comprehend. Moral confidence. By 1944, America had unexpectedly become the world's largest warden of prisoners of war, holding over 400,000 captured Axis soldiers and civilians within its own borders. Yet, in a stunning departure from the practices of its enemies, the U.S. Army adhered to the Geneva Conventions with an almost obsessive precision. Prisoners were paid small wages for their labor, permitted to send and receive letters, attend religious services of their choice, and even enroll in camp schools to learn English. And in states like Texas, where the land stretched forth in seemingly infinite abundance, they were often put to work on ranches and farms, replacing the young American men who were fighting overseas. The underlying logic was not born of sentimentality, it was ruthlessly practical. America's agricultural and industrial machine still had to run, even with millions of its sons engaged in a global conflict. Food needed to be grown, cattle tended, cotton harvested. German prisoners of war filled this critical labor gap. But to Liselott and her fellow captives, this stark practicality was indistinguishable from something far more profound: compassion. On her first night, she sat on the edge of her bunk, staring at a plate of food so generous she felt she did not deserve it. A hearty beef stew, fresh bread, a pat of real butter, even a thick slice of apple pie. She could not bring herself to eat. She was convinced it was a test of some kind. Another woman whispered, her voice trembling, that the food was surely poisoned. But by the next morning, raw hunger had overcome ingrained fear. They ate, and in that simple act, they realized something that shook the very foundations of their belief system. The enemy they had been taught to despise and fear was feeding them better, and with more dignity, than their own army ever had. In one of her first heavily censored letters home, Liselott wrote, "They told us we would be slaves, but here even the guards wish us a good morning. The sky is immense, and the very food tastes of mercy. For German women raised under the rigid, fear-based hierarchy of a totalitarian state, the greatest shock was not the material comfort, astounding as it was. It was the unexpected gift of dignity. America, it seemed, did not need to humiliate its captives to prove its power. That quiet, unshakable confidence in its own values would soon begin to dismantle, piece by piece, everything they had been forced to believe about the war, their enemies, and the nature of power itself. By the spring of 1944, the United States had undertaken a logistical undertaking unprecedented in modern history. It had become the largest prison keeper on the planet. Scattered across the country, in over 400 major base camps and hundreds of smaller branch camps, more than 400,000 Axis prisoners, Germans, Italians, and a smaller number of Japanese, were being processed, housed, fed, and assigned to work. Texas alone became a vast archipelago of captivity, hosting more than 70 major camps, dotting the landscape from the arid stretches of El Paso to the piney woods of Huntsville. Most of these facilities were constructed with breathtaking speed, standardized in their layout, rows of identical wooden barracks, utilitarian mess halls, workshops, and open parade grounds. But what truly distinguished these American POW camps was not their architecture. It was the underlying philosophy that governed them, in stark contrast to the barbed wire brutality and deliberate degradation that characterized Axis POW camps in Europe and Asia. The American facilities were designed not to crush the human spirit, but to manage it through a framework of order, routine, and a surprising degree of decency. The logic was coldly efficient and psychologically astute. A well-fed, occupied, and healthy prisoner was far less likely to cause trouble, required fewer guards to oversee, and perhaps most importantly from a long-term strategic view, could potentially become a quiet ambassador for American values once the war ended and they returned home. Each camp operated as a self-contained, functional town. They boasted libraries stocked with donated books in both English and German, infirmaries equipped with running water and clean linens that would have been the envy of many field hospitals, and workshops where prisoners could repair their own clothing and equipment. To boost morale and stave off the ennui of captivity, orchestras and theater troupes were organized, putting on performances for their fellow prisoners. To an outside world steeped in the horrors of total war, this treatment seemed absurdly, almost offensively, generous. But to the planners in the U.S. War Department, it was a form of psychological warfare of the most subtle and effective kind, a demonstration of superior strength through humanity. When the War Department began receiving a significant influx of captured German women in 1944, mostly nurses, clerical staff, and auxiliary personnel from the Luftwaffe, they faced a novel logistical challenge. The solution, pragmatic as ever, was Texas. With its vast open spaces and insatiable need for agricultural labor, it became the ideal location for experimental POW labor programs that could safely incorporate female prisoners. Many of these women first entered the system through massive transit hubs like Camp Hearn or Camp Swift, sprawling installations surrounded by endless wheat fields and mesquite thickets. The rules were simple and clearly communicated. Obey the regulations, perform your assigned work, and you will be treated fairly. Any infraction meant confinement and the loss of privileges, but for the most part, the camps operated on a foundation of mutually understood, if tentative, trust. The work assignments soon became as diverse as the Texas landscape itself. Some prisoner details were sent to harvest cotton under a blistering sun, while others sorted produce in sprawling warehouses or milked cows in modernized dairy barns. The women, however, were often assigned to ranch work, where their duties included cooking, mending fences, and tending to livestock. For them, this was a world beyond their comprehension. American soldiers and civilians willingly trusting captured enemy combatants with horses, sharp tools, and a significant degree of freedom of movement. To the American ranchers, it was simple, hard-nosed economics. There were not enough hands left to maintain the colossal war economy on the home front. To the German women, it was nothing short of a revelation. The propaganda that had relentlessly painted Americans as moral degenerates now collided head-on with a reality defined by discipline, routine, and unexpected kindness. Even the daily meals were a source of astonishment. Each prisoner received a daily ration of approximately 3,200 calories, more than many American civilians on the home front could access due to rationing. The diet consisted of fresh bread, beef, potatoes, vegetables, and even coffee or fruit when available. For Germans who were accustomed to meager ration cards and thin, watery soups, this consistent abundance felt almost sinful. Every facet of the American POW system ran like a well-oiled machine, a testament to the nation's unparalleled logistical prowess. The same industrial might that churned out tanks, bombers, and warships with breathtaking efficiency was also harnessed to feed, clothe, and house its prisoners. And to Liselott Minhart, the inescapable lesson was becoming clear. True power was not merely about the size of armies or the ferocity of their attacks. It was about the profound strength of organization, planning, and supply. She wrote in her diary, "Every crate, every single meal, every clean uniform fits perfectly into a grand, overarching plan. Nothing is wasted here. They build and manage everything like a single immense machine that never, ever sleeps." In time, she would witness this machine up close on the ranches, where it seamlessly merged with something even more bewildering to her European sensibilities: the easy, unforced generosity of ordinary Americans. The morning the work detail trucks arrived, the air was thick with the scent of dry hay and kicked-up dust. The Texas sun was still low, casting long golden stripes across the flat horizon as the American guards called out the women's names from a clipboard in a flat, bureaucratic tone. Liselott Minhart stood quietly among 24 others, her posture instinctively straight, her faded uniform as neat as circumstances allowed. None of them knew what truly awaited them beyond the main camp's gates, only that they had been selected for a labor detail on a nearby cattle ranch. Their minds, conditioned for the worst, conjured images of chains, vast fields of back-breaking labor, and endless hours under the lash of a shouting sergeant. For months, dark rumors had swirled through the barracks, stories of prisoners being marched into the desert, never to be seen again. But when the trucks rattled to a stop outside the ranch's main gate, the sight that greeted them left them utterly speechless. Instead of a phalanx of armed guards and snarling dogs, there were men in wide-brimmed hats and faded denim shirts leaning casually against the fenders of dusty pickup trucks. Real cowboys. Their leader, a tall, lean rancher named Frank Callahan, greeted them with a warm, gap-toothed grin and a lazy wave. "Mornin', ladies. You all ready to put in a day's work?" His Texan accent was so thick and cheerfully drawled that the camp interpreter had to repeat his words twice before the meaning sank in. The shock only deepened when they arrived at the Callahan Ranch. Instead of fences topped with coiled barbed wire, there were only open pastures that stretched unimpeded to the distant, hazy horizon, dotted with herds of cattle and horses grazing peacefully under the immense dome of the sky. The first order of business, Frank announced to their collective astonishment, was not punishment or immediate labor, but breakfast. Inside the main ranch house, the air was rich with the smell of bacon sizzling in cast-iron skillets, fresh baked biscuits, scrambled eggs, and coffee so strong its aroma was a physical presence. The women sat in stunned silence at a long, scarred wooden table as heaping plates were set before them. No guard stood menacingly behind their chairs. No one shouted orders. After breakfast came another surreal surprise. Frank led them out to a large corral where several calm-looking horses stood, already saddled and waiting. "You'll be learning to ride today," he stated matter-of-factly, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. "Can't rightly herd cattle on foot, and y'all are going to help us drive 'em in next week." A nervous, disbelieving ripple of laughter passed through the group. Liselott whispered under her breath, "He must be joking." But Frank was utterly serious. Within minutes, the seasoned ranch hands were pairing each woman with a horse, offering gentle instruction in broken German and expressive pantomime. The initial attempts were pure chaos. Uniform skirts tangled in the stirrups, saddles slipped, and startled shrieks echoed across the corral as a spooked mare bolted, dragging its flustered rider in frantic circles. The cowboys laughed, but not with cruelty. Their laughter was warm and encouraging, and they were quick to step in, helping each woman safely back into the saddle with a steadying hand. "Don't fight her, Mom," one of them drawled patiently. "Just feel her rhythm. She'll carry you just fine if you learn to trust her." By noon, the women were covered in a fine layer of dust and sweat, their muscles aching from the unaccustomed exercise. But they were also, unmistakably, laughing. The deep-seated fear that had been their constant companion for months began to thaw under the benevolent Texas sun. For the first time since their capture, they were outside the confines of a wire enclosure without armed guards dogging their every step. When Liselott finally managed to guide her horse into a gentle, rolling trot, she felt a sensation she had not experienced since before the war began. A taste of freedom. Not the political abstraction, but a personal, physical liberation. A feeling of pure motion, of wind in her face, of unanticipated possibility. That night, back in the simple bunkhouse that had been built for migrant workers, she wrote in her journal, "They trust us. It is a form of madness, but perhaps it is a kindness disguised as madness. They treat us not as enemies, but as people. I cannot comprehend this America." Her profound confusion was a sentiment shared by every woman in her group. They had been raised in a society that measured strength exclusively in terms of domination and absolute obedience. Here, strength manifested itself as a calm, unshakable confidence, immense patience, and a seemingly innate good humor. Even the cowboys' authority felt fundamentally different. They led not by shouting and intimidation, but by quiet example. When a horse refused to obey a command, they didn't reach for a whip. They waited, spoke to the animal in low, soothing tones, and tried again. It was a form of leadership built on mutual respect, not fear. Liselott observed this with quiet astonishment. If this was the nation they had been sent to fight and destroy, then every single thing she had been taught about America, about its people and its values, was a monstrous lie. The transformation of their status was a quiet, almost imperceptible process at first. Within a few days, the German women found themselves being treated less like prisoners and more like temporary, but valued ranch hands. Their only real guards were the immense Texas sky above, the rattling sound of the wind through the mesquite, and the casually watchful eyes of the cowboys, who treated them with a rough, almost chivalrous courtesy. Instead of iron bars and locked gates, there were now only boundaries of mutual trust. Frank Callahan had explained it with plain-spoken Texan logic. "You run, you'll just end up dying thirsty out there in the brush. You stay, you'll eat well and sleep easy. We ain't your jailers here. We're your neighbors till this war is done." Liselott didn't believe him at first. None of them did. But by the end of that first week, the truth of his words became undeniable. The camp trucks came only once a week to deliver supplies and check in, and no one ever conducted a formal head count. The women could have, at any moment, simply vanished into the vast, empty plains. But they didn't. The question was, why would they? Here, under the endless sky, they were working, laughing, and even learning new skills. They mended miles of fencing, milked cows in the cool of the early morning, and learned to toss heavy hay bales with a growing efficiency that mirrored the precision they had once applied to their wartime jobs back in Germany. More than once the cowboys stood back and watched their progress with quiet admiration. "Tougher than half the boys we've hired on," one remarked to Frank, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "And they don't complain neither." Liselott began to notice something else, something subtler. It was the way the Americans seemed to value work itself. In Germany, labor was a duty to the state, a grim necessity performed under the shadow of fear and coercion. Here, it was a source of personal pride. The cowboys joked, sang old folk songs, and turned tasks into friendly competitions. Who could rope a stray calf the fastest? Who could mend the longest stretch of busted fence before the sun dipped below the horizon? The evenings brought another profound cultural shock. Instead of being locked away in their barracks at dusk, the women were often invited to sit around a crackling fire pit, where the plaintive wail of a harmonica and the soft strumming of a guitar turned the Texas twilight into something that felt almost sacred. At first they sat apart, a silent, wary cluster of uniforms amidst the denim and flannel. But the music worked on them slowly, a gentle force eroding the invisible wall between victor and vanquished. One night, when a young cowboy began to hum the opening notes of Lili Marleen, the melancholic anthem that every German soldier and auxiliary knew by heart, Liselott found herself singing the words softly in German before she even realized what she was doing. One by one, the other women joined in. The fire crackled, and for a few fleeting, magical minutes, English and German voices blended in harmony, the same timeless melody uniting them under the same blanket of stars. There were no enemies by that fire, only people bound together by a shared song and the universal language of music. After the last note faded, Frank Callahan leaned back on his saddle, which he used as a backrest, and said softly, more to the flames than to anyone in particular, "War ends a whole lot sooner when folks finally realize they was never all that different to begin with." The next morning, the work resumed as usual, but the atmosphere was palpably lighter. The barriers of fear and deep-seated suspicion were fading with each passing day. One of the women, a bold former clerk named Anna, asked shyly if she could learn to use a lasso. The cowboys obliged with enthusiasm, teaching her the intricate wrist motion with infinite patience and good-natured humor. Before long, the sight of a German POW in a faded khaki uniform twirling a lasso over her head became a common one, drawing laughter and encouragement from both sides. But what truly cemented the change in their relationship was a sudden, violent thunderstorm that rolled in from the west one afternoon. The sky turned an ominous greenish black. The wind began to howl like a banshee, and lightning split the horizon with terrifying frequency. The cattle, sensing the approaching danger, panicked and began to scatter in all directions across the open range. Without a moment's hesitation, the women ran to help. They mounted horses bareback, shouted, waved their arms, and rode alongside the cowboys through blinding sheets of cold rain and ankle-deep mud, working in concert to drive the terrified herd back toward the relative safety of the holding pens. Hours later, soaked to the bone, shivering, and caked in mud, they returned to the ranch yard together, exhausted but victorious. Not a single animal had been lost. Frank walked among them, his face streaked with rain and grime, but his eyes shining with unmistakable pride. "Well, I'll be," he said, a wide grin spreading across his face. "Guess y'all ain't just city girls after all." That night, in a gesture of pure Texan acceptance, the ranch hands quietly hung a hand-painted sign over the bunkhouse door. It read, "The German Cowgirls." Liselott looked at it, her eyes wide with disbelief, and then she laughed, a real, heartfelt laugh that turned into tears of release. somewhere deep inside her soul, a fundamental shift had occurred. The war, the propaganda, the constant gnawing fear, it all seemed to belong to a distant, fading world. What mattered now was the immediacy of survival, the satisfaction of honest work, and the strange, powerful dignity that came from being trusted. In a world consumed by hatred and violence, that simple trust was rarer and more valuable than gold. By the time early autumn arrived, the air on the Texas plains began to carry a new, crisp coolness, and in tandem, the last remaining walls around the German women's hearts continued to soften. The war still raged with terrible fury across Europe, but here, in this isolated pocket of America, time seemed to move to a different, more peaceful rhythm. The days were filled with the tangible rewards of hard work, and the nights with the soft sounds of quiet conversation and the relentless hum of crickets. For the first time since their capture, a profound sense of calm was allowed to settle over them. It was during this period that the camp authorities made a momentous announcement. Each prisoner was permitted to write one letter home. They were each given a single sheet of official camp stationery. The contents would be censored, of course, but even within those strict limits, it was a precious, rare opportunity to send a message to the world they had been torn from. That night, the bunkhouse was utterly silent, save for the soft, persistent scratching of pencil leads on paper. Liselotte's hand trembled slightly as she began to write. "Dearest Mother, I am alive and well, and I must tell you something that you will surely find impossible to believe. I am working on a farm in Texas. They call it a ranch. The people here are kind. Yes, truly, genuinely kind. They give us more food than I can sometimes eat. So much food. They have even taught us to ride horses. The men wear hats as wide as dinner plates and drink a peculiar fizzy beverage called Coca-Cola. They play music for us after the day's work is done and are teaching us their songs." She paused, staring at the words on the page. Would her mother think she had lost her mind, succumbed to some form of delusion? The propaganda in Germany was unequivocal. American POW camps were places of brutal, inhumane treatment, where prisoners were systematically starved and beaten. But here, in this sun-drenched, wind-swept paradise, she was drinking real coffee every morning and had even been taught how to make a spicy local dish called chili. She dipped her pencil and continued, her script becoming more fervent. "Mama, the most astonishing thing is that they trust us. We could run away if we wished, but we do not. Because here, in all the ways that truly matter to the human spirit, we are free. I never imagined that freedom could possibly look like this." The letters were collected the following morning. Weeks later, the first replies began to trickle in, each one carefully censored by American officers and trembling with palpable disbelief. "Liselotte, are you certain? You must be mistaken. Perhaps you are dreaming or have been deceived." Her mother wrote, "They would never, ever treat their prisoners with such decency." Her mother was not alone in her skepticism. Other women received similar responses from their families, who refused to believe tales of hamburgers, open fields, and friendly cowboys. To those still enduring nightly bombing raids and severe rationing back in the shattered homeland, such a life sounded like a fantastical, impossible fairy tale. Even the American officers who reviewed the incoming mail seemed faintly amused by the entire situation. "Y'all are writing fairy tales over here?" One captain chuckled to Liselotte, shaking his head. "Ain't nobody back in Germany gonna believe a word of it." But the reality they were living was undeniable. With each passing day, the German prisoners rode deeper into a version of America that defied every single lesson of hatred they had been taught. They saw it in the staggering abundance that surrounded them: eggs by the dozen, meat by the pound, sugar by the sack. They saw it in the powerful machines, tractors that roared across fields, consuming gasoline as if it were water, a seemingly endless resource. They saw it most of all in the attitude of the people. No rigid hierarchy, no mandatory bowing to superiors, no undercurrent of fear. When Liselot finally gathered the courage to ask one of the older cowboys why he and the others treated them with such consistent kindness, he merely shrugged his shoulders and replied in his slow drawl, "Lady, far as we're concerned, the war's over for you the minute you set foot on this soil. Ain't no use in fighting ghosts." It wasn't precisely forgiveness, not in the grand philosophical sense. It was something more pragmatic, a uniquely American brand of mercy that measured a person's worth by their willingness to work and their integrity, not by the flag they had once fought under. One afternoon, a new group of prisoners arrived, male German soldiers from a different, more traditional camp. They watched in stunned, speechless disbelief as the women led horses from the barn, laughing and chatting freely with the cowboys as if they were old friends. "This cannot be real," one of the new arrivals muttered in German, his voice thick with suspicion. "It is a clever illusion." But it was not an illusion. For these battle-hardened soldiers, the sight of their female compatriots riding across open pastures, unshackled and unchained, was a powerful, tangible proof that captivity under the Americans could be something entirely different from the humiliation and brutality they had been conditioned to expect. And as these men were gradually integrated into the work crews, they too began to soften, their hardened exteriors slowly melting under the Texas sun. The cowboys, with their inherent patience, taught them how to mend a fence properly, how to throw a lasso, and eventually how to two-step to a country tune played on a guitar. By November, the Callahan Ranch had become something that should have been impossible in the midst of a global war, a small, thriving corner of reconciliation and mutual respect. For Liselot, it was the beginning of a quiet, profound revelation that humanity could not only survive, but even flourish in the most unlikely of circumstances, and that genuine kindness could take root and grow even in the barren soil of war. She did not yet know that these hard-won lessons would follow her back across the ocean, reshaping everything she believed about the world, her former enemies, and herself. April 1945. The wind sweeping across the Texas plains now carried the fresh, hopeful scent of spring grass and recent rain. New calves stumbled on wobbly legs in the pastures. The fields were painting themselves in vibrant shades of green, and a sense of restless energy was in the air. Rumors began to swirl among the prisoners, moving faster than the dust devils that danced across the landscape. Germany was collapsing. Berlin was surrounded. Hitler was dead, some said by his own hand. Others whispered that it was all just more enemy propaganda, a trick to break their spirit. At the Callahan Ranch, the German women continued their daily routines. They mended torn saddles in the tack room, washed piles of laundry by hand, and took their turns herding cattle. But a new, palpable tension hung in the air, as thick and heavy as the humidity before a storm. The radio in Frank's kitchen, which was usually tuned to stations playing country music or broadcasting baseball games, now crackled with nothing but urgent news bulletins from Europe. That afternoon, Frank came out to the barn where the women were working. His face was uncharacteristically solemn. He held his worn hat in one hand, and in the other he gripped a tightly folded newspaper. "Ladies," he said, his voice low and respectful. "It's over." For a long, suspended moment, no one spoke. The words seemed to hang in the dusty air of the barn, a thunderclap that had not yet broken. "Over? What do you mean?" Liselot finally managed to ask, her voice barely a whisper. "The war?" Frank nodded slowly, his eyes meeting each of theirs in turn. "Germany has surrendered. It's finished." Some of the women froze where they stood. Others let the tools they were holding, brushes, hoof picks, clatter to the wooden floor. Anna, who had become Liselot's closest friend, covered her mouth with both hands and began to cry, soft, shuddering sobs. Liselott herself simply stared at the dusty ground between her boots, her mind a perfect, numb blank. For years, every single aspect of her existence, every breath, every fear, every memory of loss, had been defined by the war. Now, with a few simple words, it was all gone. There were no cheers of victory, no celebrations, only a stunned, heavy silence, broken by the distant, unconcerned lowing of a cow. That evening, the women gathered around their usual fire pit, their faces illuminated by the flickering orange flames, each one grappling with a tumultuous mix of emotions: relief, grief, disorientation, and a profound anxiety about the future. Frank brought out a large pot of coffee and poured a cup for each of them. "It's done now," he said quietly, his voice a gentle rumble. "You all will be heading home before too long." The word home struck Liselott with a force more powerful than any news of surrender. Home. What did that word even mean now? Their cities were likely piles of rubble, their families displaced, missing, or dead. Germany was a physical and moral wasteland. She sipped her coffee, the bitter liquid a familiar comfort, and watched the fiery sparks from the fire drift upward into the vast, starry night. "What will we even go back to?" she murmured, not really expecting an answer. Frank didn't offer one. He simply sat beside her, a solid, silent presence. Everyone gathered around that fire knew there was no easy answer to that question. In the days that followed, U.S. Army officers arrived in official jeeps to begin the complex process of repatriation. Trucks were dispatched to transport the prisoners back to the main camps, where they would be formally processed and eventually placed on ships bound for Europe. The cowboys stood in a silent, somber group near the ranch house as the women packed their few personal belongings into small canvas bags. The extra clothes they had been given, the letters from home, a few small handmade keepsakes. Frank approached Liselott as she was carefully folding her worn leather work gloves, a parting gift from one of the hands, into her bag. "Reckon you'll be seeing Germany again soon?" he asked softly. She nodded, her throat suddenly too tight for words. "Thank you, Mr. Callahan," she finally managed, her voice thick with emotion. For everything." He smiled, the skin around his eyes crinkling into familiar crow's feet. "Ain't nothing to thank me for, Lisa. You all worked hard. You earned your keep. That's all any man or woman can do in this world." Then, with a playful grin that broke through the solemnity of the moment, he reached behind him and produced something wrapped in simple brown paper. "Got a little going-away present for you." Inside was a brand-new Stetson hat, its color a rich cream, the felt as soft as suede. "So you don't forget Texas," he said simply. Liselott laughed, the sound catching in her throat and turning into tears that streamed freely down her cheeks. She placed the hat on her head, the wide brim shading her eyes. The ranch hands who had gathered around let out a chorus of whoops and joyful clapping, and someone shouted, "Yee-haw! The German cowgirl rides again!" When the trucks finally rumbled to life and began to pull away, the women looked back through the wooden slats of the truck beds. They saw the ranch, the red barn, the turning windmill, the main house, and the men, their figures growing smaller, waving their hats in a final, fond farewell. For Liselott, that image would be seared into her memory forever. It was not just a place she was leaving, it was a profound revelation she was carrying with her. She had arrived in Texas as a frightened enemy prisoner, and she was leaving as something else entirely. A person who had been shown a different way to live, a way where human dignity was not derived from rank or enforced through fear, but was granted through simple, mutual respect. As the truck bounced down the dusty, unpaved road, the immense horizon of America gradually disappearing behind a screen of mesquite and dust, she whispered to herself, a new conviction hardening within her. Perhaps we lost the war, but maybe, just maybe, we can still learn how to win the peace. In that moment of parting, Liselott Minhart realized that the greatest freedom she had found in America was not the physical freedom to move about unchained. It was a moral and spiritual freedom, the freedom from hatred, the freedom to see her former enemies as human beings. She had witnessed the transformative power of simple kindness, and that understanding had irrevocably changed the course of her life.